On this edition of Independent Sources, added pressure. A one-time ethnic media powerhouse is on the verge of collapse while city government debates assisting the sector. And the Latino disconnect. A new report shows that the stereotyping and marginalization of Latinos has increased in the mainstream media since a major corporate merger. Those stories and more coming up. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. The 103-year-old paper El Diario was once a powerhouse in New York City, so much so that politicians were known to clamor for their endorsement. But these days, the paper can't even keep its staff on payroll. Dwindling readership and ad revenue have left it on the verge of stopping the presses for good. This has prompted unprecedented measures from the city, including a city council meeting to address the issue and a promise of more assistance from Mayor Bill de Blasio and Council Speaker Melissa Mugg-Viverito. Zyphus Lebrun spoke to journalist Gustavo Martinez and Jahangir Khattak, the co-director of the Center for Community and Ethnic Media, about El Diario's decline and the call for the city to pump more ad revenue into the ethnic media.
Gustavo, Jahangir, thank you both for being in studio with me today.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so Gustavo, I'll just start with you. You worked at El Diario for 3 years. What was it like for you? What was your experience like at El Diario?
It was a great experience, I would say. I was privileged to cover sports for them, so it gave me access to different venues, different events that many people dream of being at. Even myself as a kid probably dreamt of being at these places. Never imagined that El Diario would give me such an opportunity, so it was a wonderful experience as a reporter, as a person who likes sports as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what's it like now? I mean, things, from what I'm hearing, things are kind of descending over there. How bad is it over there right now?
Well, up until I was there, I don't know what it's like right now. I mean, only from what I hear from people in there. But it was a really sad environment. People were demoralized because they saw the layoffs coming, the restructuring of the company and how they were letting people do less and less stuff, like probably signaling to the soon departure from the paper. So it was kind of depressing in a way to be in that environment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Jahangir, I mean, you, through the organization that you work with, you look at and you see the progress of a lot of, ethnic papers and so forth. With El Diario, is it a situation where maybe that they've lost touch with a little bit of their base, the community base? Because there's been criticism in that regard.
Well, I mean, El Diario has been facing criticism from former employees as well as those who are following it. But newspapers overall, wherever you see them, they have been going through challenges from time to time. We have seen newspapers which have changed their character, but changed their frequency. Mm-hmm. We have seen newspapers which were daily newspapers for years, and all of a sudden we hear that they have become weeklies. For example, Nowy Dziennik, which used to be a daily newspaper, it's a Polish language newspaper, and they recently turned into a weekly newspaper. Then we have newspapers which are adjusting to the market conditions as well. The overall media landscape is changing. Journalism is in transition, and we see more of media coming up on the digital side, and so there are too many factors. I mean, it is hard to say, because then there are institutions which have their own internal weaknesses and politics as well. So there are different factors that impact. So I won't particularly say much about El Diario, but
right.
Overall, when I look at the media scene,
right.
So there are different factors which are impacting those publications, and there are many who are improvising. There
right.
are many who are looking for ways to make themselves more sustainable in the long run. There are many who are changing, their presentation, coming more on the, digital side.
Right.
They have a much, stronger online presence. So it is a transition, and certainly ethnic media has all along faced challenges. Not newspapers like El Diario, which has always been a real big newspaper,
Right, compared to the other
compared
ones.
to the others,
Right.
like a small publication which is coming out of the basement,
Right.
and one person wearing all possible hats and running
Right.
that newspaper for years.
Right.
So they are the people who are also facing, I think, much serious challenges than the bigger newspapers are. But the problem is that they are not very visible,
Very visible.
or they may not be very well noted by the mainstream.
Right.
So that's the problem. Otherwise, I think you will see similar problems pretty much everywhere.
Right.
It is a survival game. Everybody is trying to survive, and that's why there is a big movement all over. Like there's always a demand from the ethnic press as well as community press, which is also playing a very critical role in our city's civic life. So they have all along been looking for ways to make themselves more sustainable and get some help from wherever it may be,
Right.
mainly from the city as well.
Right. I'll get to that point in a second, but I just wanted to go back a couple of steps. A few years ago, it seemed that the ethnic media was a little bit impervious to what was happening to other media at the time, and that was something that they were lauded for, the fact that they were a niche market and that, the people in the communities were still buying up papers and stuff like that. What happened to that? I mean, did it just kind of flip over because of the economic crisis? What led to that?
It's not just, I think certainly economic crisis has contributed to that. But besides that, I think it is the news consumption patterns as well, which are also changing. If you look at the data, so most of the people, whether they are in the mainstream, where majority are consuming news through maybe their mobile devices, and I think you will find the same pattern in the ethnic and community sector as well. Many people are like the news consumption patterns are also changing.
Right.
So that's also forcing many publications, to change their strategy in terms of their messaging and in terms of, getting advertisements and looking for some alternative sources of revenue. So it's like, I think the conditions, the news consumption patterns, the advertising market, the landscape that is changing, and overall the changing landscape of the media, how it is being produced, how it is being consumed, and how it is being sustained. So these are the three major factors, and there are changes in all those three areas.
So Gustavo, to you now, you covered recently a city council meeting focusing on something Jahangir pointed to, this whole idea of going to the city for more funding, for ads funding and so forth. Let's talk a little bit about that. What came out of that meeting recently?
There's a concern in the city from city officials that their messages won't be reaching ethnic communities, minority communities, immigrant communities in the city if there's not some sort of, I don't want to say intervention, but some sort of help from city government, and they call it a first step towards that, to try and put something in place so that ethnic media is not out of the loop in terms of messaging and also advertising dollars, which is basically what makes them survive.
Right.
Many of them, actually. El Diario, though, it's not the same as a small paper, as Jahangir was saying, in the basement. El Diario is actually, I think, the fourth largest receiver of money from the city government. So El Diario is asking now for more. I don't know how that formula will work. Yet all these other media is not receiving enough money compared to other outlets that probably don't have communities in mind. There are other kind of publications, perhaps. So it's a first step. I don't know. There's also concerns about the government getting involved with media.
Right.
So how will that play out? It's also very. It's a fine line that we're walking right now.
Right, and that's what I was going to pick up on and say, because one of the publishers of the Black Star News, his name is Milton Alamadi, and he was quoted recently as saying, "We would rather lose the advertising, that self-censorship or toned down journalism," and is there a concern at all that, hey, listen, if you're getting more money from the city's going to influence what you're reporting on, Jahangir?
I mean, It's hard to say that, because I would say that certainly any advertiser, whether it is the city or anyone, whether it's a like corporate advertiser or a government advertiser, in either case, certainly they will always have a certain level of influence. And different agencies and departments use advertisements not just as a tool for messaging, which is the primary purpose, but certainly it is more strategic as well, because they have to send a message to a particular community. So they pick newspapers which may have larger audience, and they know that it will reach there. Overall, when you look at the situation, I think it is not just the influence. I think that it is the need as well that you are looking at on the community side as well. And the newspapers certainly are more than willing. The bigger the newspaper, it may have, I think, I don't want to use the term, but maybe it may have like more ability to reject such pressures where they have to change their policies. But that may not be possible in a smaller publication, where they are receiving, like a small publication is receiving like 2 advertisements a year.
Right.
And they know that if we don't entertain the city agencies, requirements, they may not have any formal requirements, but like, some sort of messaging that the city agency people want that should go out. I don't think so that it will be easy for them to resist that.
Right.
So they will always buckle into that kind of pressure.
Right.
But at the bottom of it, remember, when you are dealing with the city agencies, these are the agencies which are impacting everybody's life. So I don't think so that it will have a real impact, like, because these are not political entities. These are, civic agencies which are directly serving people. So if they have a message which is impacting somebody's life, I don't think so that any publisher, whether it is in the ethnic media or community media or any bigger media, they will have much problem with that.
Right.
Yes, if it comes to some political angling,
Right.
that is where then you see the difference. And that difference again is very much visible at the bigger level.
Right.
At the smaller level, I don't think so that it will be that big a problem.
Okay. Before we go, we're running out of time. I was also reading that the mayor and the city council speaker have pledged some sort of assistance. Has there been any kind of monetary value put on that, or are they talking maybe other things to be able to put in place?
They came up with a directory of ethnic media outlets for city agencies to use and reach out. So that's basically what they've done so far. They announced it just I think an hour before the press conference and eventual hearing on Wednesday. They announced these directory for city agencies, but so far that's about it. I think I don't know that they have done any monetary pledge or contribution.
So the effort there is to get city agencies to access more of the ethnic media, to work with them more in the future at least.
Yes, and also during the hearing there was statements to the effect that they want to create not just best practices, but some sort of mandates that establish how each agency should reach out to real ethnic community, any publications that are putting out the word for whatever programs or job opportunities or any kind of message that the government wants to send.
Okay. All right. Well, Gustavo, John, Gareth, thank you very much for being in studio today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
When we come back, why a media merger is contributing to the continued marginalization of Latinos. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. This week, Voices of New York highlights a 3-part series on fighting gun violence in the city. In the first part of the series, Marlon Peterson, a former inmate, recounts his childhood growing up in Crown Heights. He talks about the traumatic life events that changed him and the circumstances that eventually led him to spending 10 years of his life in prison. In the second part of the series, Peterson illustrates how his past has led him to become an anti-gun violence advocate and opens up in a heart-to-heart conversation with his parents about seeing their youngest son on the news in connection with a murder case. He's hoping to confront gun violence by creating child-safe zones. He believes that convincing people to think differently about how they see themselves and the role they want to take on in their communities will ultimately produce some positive and effective change. Look out for all 3 parts of the series on Brick TV. Taiwanese artist Long Bin Chin is turning discarded books and phone books into large busts and sculptures in his Bronx studio. Many of Chin's sculptures depict religious icons and historical figures, and his work reflects the books from which they are created. For example, Chin's sculpture of Ganesh came from using Indian texts, and his bust of Einstein was made of books on the physicists. Sinovision gives you a glimpse of the long and sometimes hazardous process that goes into making Chin's sculptures. Sing Tao Daily reports on the Warm Winter campaign that's helping support homeless people and their pets. 99% of shelters in the city do not accept pets, and many homeless people consider their pets as their only family. So they are left with no other option but to stay on the street with their animals in the cold winter. WeChat, a social media platform popular among the Chinese, has called on New Yorkers via a blog called We Pause NYC to raise awareness and to come together to help support these homeless people and their pets. They hope to do this by donating money to contribute to a warm winter kit, which includes a piece of waterproof cloth, a blanket, a scarf, a pair of gloves, dog food, and socks. The founders of the blog plan to raise $3,500 on the internet to purchase 50 kits that they will distribute to people in need. And finally, backed by popular demand, on Kentucky Avenue, a celebration of Atlantic City's historic club Harlem, returns to City College's Performing Arts Center, Aaron Davis Hall, on Friday, February 19th for a 3-day encore engagement. The musical shines the spotlight on a little-known piece of Black history. Where other Chitlin Circuit clubs were segregated, Club Harlem was integrated in a segregated city. The musical is fictional, but is inspired by real people in a real place called Kentucky Avenue in Atlantic City, one of the premier night spots for Black entertainment in the country. The show's producers say On Kentucky Avenue offers a fantastic opportunity to present an exciting nugget of our past in an imaginative, fresh way. Those were just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. A new report from Columbia University's Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts finds that Latinos are more marginalized and stereotyped since the 2011 Comcast NBCUniversal merger. The report states that despite Latinos increasing buying power and sheer numbers, they are still underrepresented in front of and behind the camera, and Latino leaders are still underpaid. I spoke with one of the authors of the report, Francis Negron-Muntaner. I guess we want to go right into this, the heart of your report, the Latino disconnect, Latinos in the age of media mergers. Basically, your report concluded that it hasn't been good for Latinos, these mergers.
Well, I don't think it's been good for anyone or the public at large in general, but our emphasis was in the Latino community. We wanted to know if these memorandum of understanding that happened before transactions occur were actually followed by the companies afterwards. So we looked at 3 years before the merger and 3 years afterwards and compared what was the rate of diversity before and after. Okay. And we found that, in general, the rate of diversity was lower. With very small increases, mostly in front of the camera.
For instance, they would have a talent, so to speak, someone who's a host of a show and giving you a false impression that this was really diverse, when in reality it wasn't.
Well, I think this is happening not only for Latinos. If you look at African American inclusion, you see the same thing, that there's a lot more people in front of the camera than behind the camera. And that creates the false illusion that there is greater inclusivity than there actually is, when there's only perhaps one category. Now, of course, if you look at news, it's a different situation. That's mostly for entertainment. In news, we're looking at, I think, the worst numbers of all, both in terms of the types of stories that are covered and also the talent that's in front and behind the camera. One
of the interesting findings from your key findings from this report is that you said that stereotypes on screen increased after the merger. Talk about that a little bit. How did that happen?
So in our first report in 2014, we actually made the prediction that it would be highly possible that if Latino actors increase in front of the camera, the stereotypes would also increase. When we did this report, we looked at this particular instance. That's exactly what happened. Actors increased about 1 to 2%. In television, mostly. Film is another story. But stereotypes increased twofold, or a little bit over twofold. So in that regard, you get a little bit more representation and a lot more stereotypes. Now, what are the stereotypes? We call the people in uniform. You know, inmates, cops, maids, janitors. I mean, it's mostly the type of character that you will see.
From the 60s, if you will.
Well, actually, in our prior report, when we looked from the 40s to the present, we found that there were two moments on television that per capita, the representation was higher than now. That was in the 50s, when you had I Love Lucy, you had Desi Arnaz,
yes.
so he was a top 10 show. And then in the 70s, early 70s, when you had Chico and the Man, you
What's
had Freddie
Happening?
Prinze was in a top 10 show for a little bit.
So, isn't it ironic that as this country is getting much more diverse, media have been getting less and less diverse? How do you reconcile the two?
Well, I think our explanation is that in the 40s and 50s, the increase in representation had partly to do with the fact that the U.S. was at war and that were directives from the top to Hollywood to diversify so that those products could be seen in Latin America and there would be no problems.
Okay.
In the 70s, you had pressure from below. Civil rights movements that made representation a civil right, and they started pressuring particularly television, to include more people of color in general. Once those pressures are off from below or from above, then it goes back to business as usual.
And so how has Washington been in this case? Has Washington been pushing these media outlets to really reflect the diversity of the country?
Not really. I mean, you don't get much pressure from Congress. Of course, there are people in Congress that are concerned, and when these discussions happen, you generally see members of various caucuses and others express themselves, but there's no real legislation that's pressuring the media industry to diversify.
What about from the grassroots, from the bottom, as you put it?
Well, in our report, in both reports, the first and the second one, we have chapters that look at advocacy, because if it wasn't for advocacy of everybody that's doing it, you know, our media would look very different. It would look worse. So in this case, definitely there was a mass mobilization at various levels, and it included people in Congress like Tony Cardenas. It included grassroots, included people online, in California, in Washington, all over the country. So in our conclusion of that is that advocacy is actually very important, because the companies really can't make any money or sell anything if people are not watching. So if people are mobilized and pressure the companies to produce better media, we will get better media. We actually have more power than we think.
And in the report, you also say that these mergers have made media more expensive. Talk a little bit more about that.
Well, the principle, what happens with in the media industry and others is that you have more and more mergers, which means that the power is in less and less hands. That means that there's no competition. So these companies can set prices, and if you want cable or if you want media, you're going to have to pay the price, or there's nowhere else to go. So for instance, if the new merger with Charter and Time Warner Cable comes together, Charter and Comcast are actually going to be 90% of the market for broadband. So that's a duopoly. You know, like you don't have much more, you don't have much where to go.
Okay, and also with this report, the authors, principally you, made some recommendations for the way things should be changed. And the first one you said is to develop a comprehensive and effective plan to diversify leadership and creative positions. I mean, how do you go about doing that?
Well, most companies have a diversity department or a diversity unit whose job is to monitor what's happening in the company. So what we're suggesting is, unfortunately, that those units are generally the least powerful in the company. They actually don't have the power to say, this is going to go this way. They can report, they can influence, but they can't determine. So what we're suggesting is that perhaps companies really have to make a plan and stick to the plan and deliver on the plan, rather than leave it to these more ad hoc initiatives within the companies that don't really seem to work.
Okay. What else are you recommending? That you have about 7 or 8 recommendations. So what are the other ones you think that are important that?
Well, for instance, when the stereotypes are pervasive not only in entertainment, they're also pervasive in news. And the only way that that's going to change, or several of the ways that that's going to change, is that you need more diversified people in these spaces that bring different experiences and different points of view that might be available to the team that is there. And 2, I think you actually need education So people's imagination get a little more robust. So they don't think that every time they see a Latino, they can only go in one or two types of shows. But rather than people are heterogeneous and multiple and can go anywhere.
What's in it for, let's say, Time Warner or Comcast to implement what are your recommendations?
Well, I think they'll get more of an audience, and particularly if you look at the younger demographic, the younger you look, the more diverse the demographic is. So, for instance, Latinos, African Americans together make about half of the coveted demographic for advertising. And the more diverse you have your offerings, the more eyeballs you'll get, particularly to media like film and television that are actually losing audiences to online and video games and other types of entertainment.
Speaking of online, new media, if you will, there's been studies that show they're not as diverse as well, despite the diversity in relatively young demographics. And so, what is one to do?
Well, we looked at Netflix and Hulu. We compared those two outlets and saw, well, are they any better? Are they the alternative? And we saw that Hulu was actually more diverse than Netflix. Netflix looks more like film diversity, which is very low, even lower than TV in most cases. But Hulu was different because they had one show called East Los High, where most Latino talent was working. However, it in a way skewed Hulu's numbers to the top. And that show, I mean, they don't have ratings, but that show is one of the highest, one of the most watched shows on Hulu. So it's clear there's a trend there's a trend of people that are underserved by the current offerings that I think would gravitate towards certain outlets that provided them if they were provided.
Is this an opportunity for independent movie producers, filmmakers, people who care about these diversity issues, people who want televisions and film to represent the country at large?
Well, one of the things that we found earlier was that the self-curated outlets like YouTube were significantly more diverse than the ones that are controlled. So, for instance, in certain categories like music and lifestyle, etc., Latinos were represented equally as the population. So, since now a lot of scouting is taking place online, like there are people in different units that are actually looking at what's happening online to recruit talent, I think it is an opportunity for people that are independent to get their work known and seen. The paradox is that once even the online organizations and companies, once they become established, they don't behave that different from the established organizations. So it's a constant pushing of the media industry in order for it to be as diverse as the people that live in this country and beyond are.
Francis Negron-Muntaner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.